Forget the sanitized Hollywood version. The truth of William Wallace's death is so much darker, so much more grotesque, that even hardened medieval warriors struggled to stomach it. But to understand why England unleashed one of the most barbaric executions in history, you need to know how Wallace rose from obscurity to become the greatest threat King Edward I ever faced. Born around 1270 in the lowlands of Scotland, Wallace wasn't born a noble with vast lands or titles. He was an outlaw, a man of the people, forged in a world where England claimed dominion over Scotland and crushed resistance with brute force. But Wallace refused to bow. In 1297, he led a ragtag Scottish force to an impossible victory at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, defeating a far larger English army and sending shockwaves across Europe. Overnight, he transformed into a symbol of defiance, a commoner who dared humiliate the most powerful king in Christendom. For a brief moment, Scotland stood free. Wallace was named Guardian of Scotland, his name whispered with reverence in every village. But glory came with a price. Defeat at Falkirk in 1298 forced Wallace into the shadows. While other Scottish nobles bent the knee to Edward, Wallace kept fighting, a ghost in the Highlands, striking when least expected. By 1304, Wallace was the last holdout, the lone figure who refused submission, and that made him more dangerous than an army. Edward I wasn't just hunting a rebel anymore, he was hunting a legend, one that had to be destroyed publicly, brutally, and without mercy. Wallace's survival after Falkirk was nothing short of miraculous. Hunted relentlessly, he lived like a fugitive, moving through forests and mountains, supported only by loyal clansmen who risked everything to hide him. To Edward I, this was intolerable. It wasn't enough to defeat the Scots militarily, he needed Wallace's head on a spike to crush Scottish morale once and for all. But it wasn't English swords that brought Wallace down. It was betrayal. In August 1305, after years in hiding, Wallace was captured near Glasgow by Sir John de Menteith, a Scottish noble who had once been counted among his country's defenders. Whether Menteith was motivated by loyalty to Edward, personal ambition, or sheer survival, we'll never know. What's certain is that he delivered Wallace into English hands, bound like a criminal, and forever branded his name with treachery. The English wasted no time parading their prize. Wallace was hauled hundreds of miles south to London, a journey designed as a living humiliation. Crowds gathered in every town along the way to jeer and spit at the man once hailed as Scotland's saviour. By the time he reached the capital, the stage was set for his final act. London was eager for the spectacle. Wallace had become infamous not only for Stirling Bridge, but also for raids in northern England. Tales of villages burned, soldiers massacred, and nobles slain circulated widely, exaggerated by English chroniclers eager to paint him as a monster. To the people of London, he was no freedom fighter. He was the embodiment of barbarism. When Wallace was delivered to the Tower of London, he was treated not as a prisoner of war, but as the king's personal trophy. He was locked away, awaiting what everyone knew would not be a fair trial, but a performance. Edward I didn't just want Wallace dead. He wanted to make an example of him, to turn his suffering into theatre, a deterrent for anyone daring to dream of Scottish independence. The betrayal that had brought Wallace into captivity was bitter enough, but the sham of justice awaiting him in Westminster would make clear that his fate was sealed long before he set foot in the hall. Edward wanted not just to break Wallace's body, but to shatter the legend of William Wallace once and for all. But Edward underestimated something. Legends do not die so easily. On August 23rd, 1305, the man who had once defied the might of England stood in chains before Westminster Hall. The great Gothic chamber, with its soaring timber roof and stone walls, had never seen such a spectacle. Word had spread across London that William Wallace, the outlaw, the rebel, the so-called butcher of Englishmen, would finally face judgment. Nobles, clerics, and curious citizens packed the hall, straining to glimpse the Scotsman who had haunted Edward I for nearly a decade. But this was no trial in the modern sense. It was political theatre, a public performance orchestrated by Edward himself. Wallace had not been brought to plead his case. He had been brought to be destroyed. Every charge, every word had been written in advance. The accusations rolled out like a litany of sins: treason, rebellion, murder, arson, massacres. Wallace was accused of slaughtering innocents during raids, of betraying the English crown, of crimes so horrific they demanded the harshest punishment imaginable. Yet there was one glaring absurdity. Wallace had never sworn fealty to Edward I. How could a man betray a king he had never acknowledged? When given the chance to respond, Wallace did not beg. He did not weep. He raised his chained hands and thundered words that echoed across the hall. "I could not be a traitor, for I never swore allegiance to Edward." The defiance in his voice shocked many in attendance. Even in captivity, he refused to bow. His declaration did not save him. The court, acting as Edward's mouthpiece, ignored the logic of his defence. The verdict had been written before Wallace ever set foot inside the chamber: guilty on all counts. The punishment, worse than death itself, was already decided. The sentence was a death reserved only for traitors, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. A ritual of pain so unspeakable that its purpose was not merely to kill, but to annihilate a person's dignity, body, and legacy. Wallace would be paraded through the streets, publicly humiliated, tortured alive, and then carved into pieces for all to see. It was, in every sense, a performance designed to terrify. King Edward wasn't content with simply defeating William Wallace. He wanted to make him an eternal warning, a symbol of what awaited anyone who dared challenge England's rule. The message to Scotland was clear. Rebellion would end not in glory, but in degradation, torment, and obliteration. Wallace listened to his sentence with the same steel that had carried him through battle. His enemies may have bound his body, but they could not chain his spirit. By refusing to recognise Edward's authority, even as doom closed in, Wallace turned the trial into a final act of resistance. The sham was over. The verdict was in. Now came the true horror, the execution itself, staged not just to end Wallace's life, but to etch terror into the memory of all who witnessed it. On August 23, 1305, Londoners poured into the streets, summoned not by justice but by bloodlust. They wanted to see the man whose defiance had humiliated their king, the so-called Terror of the North. William Wallace was dragged from the Tower of London, shackled, but still towering over most of his guards. His hair was matted, his body broken from months of chains, but his presence alone still radiated defiance. What followed was not a march, but a ritual of humiliation. Tied to a wooden hurdle, Wallace was dragged through the filthy streets by horses, jeered at, pelted with refuse. Every mile was meant to strip away dignity, to make the traitor look less like a man and more like a defeated beast. But witnesses record something unsettling. Wallace did not beg. He did not scream. His silence unnerved even the crowd. At Smithfield, the performance reached its climax. The scaffold was waiting. First came the hanging. Wallace's body was hoisted by the neck, suspended until he was on the edge of death, but not allowed release. Before life could slip away, he was cut down, gasping, dragged to the ground. Then came the drawing. His abdomen was sliced open, his entrails pulled out before his eyes. The executioners mocked him, feeding parts of his own organs to the fire while the crowd roared. Through it all, Wallace endured in grim silence, a final refusal to give his enemies the satisfaction of his cries. Finally, the quartering. His body was hacked into 4 pieces, each sent to different corners of the kingdom: Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, Perth. Grim trophies nailed in place to remind Scots of the price of rebellion. His head, tarred to preserve it, was fixed on a spike above London Bridge, staring down at every traveller who crossed the Thames. A message from Edward. This is what happens when you defy a king. But Edward's cruelty had an unintended effect. The spectacle meant to erase Wallace only immortalised him. To the English, he was a warning. To the Scots, he became a martyr. His silence in the face of torment, his refusal to acknowledge Edward even as his body was destroyed, gave birth to a legend that no blade could cut apart. In life, William Wallace had been a rebel commander. In death, he became something far greater, a symbol of freedom, a rallying cry for generations of Scots who refused to kneel. Centuries later, his name would inspire uprisings, novels, and films. But the brutal truth of his execution is often softened or forgotten. Wallace's end wasn't heroic in the traditional sense. It was grotesque, savage, designed to dehumanize. Yet in that darkness lay his greatest victory. King Edward could destroy Wallace's body, but he could not kill what Wallace represented: the belief that even the mightiest empire cannot crush a people's will to be free.